Welcome, today's story is full of drama. Like and subscribe to stay updated. Let's get started.
I'm always on the lookout for a good deal, which is why I regularly browse government auction sites. Living in rural northern Minnesota with limited mobility gives me plenty of time to indulge in this usually fruitless hobby. Recently, some properties up for sale caught my attention. The state of Michigan was selling off lesser-used parks and sections of parkland. One listing stood out: the Michigan Lake unit from State Forestry split into 3 parcels. Intrigued, I requested the terms of sale. When dealing with the government, reading the fine print is essential, and this one had plenty of strings attached. The southernmost parcel was about 70 acres and designated as a historical site, meaning any modifications required extensive approval. The property featured a stripped-down sawmill powered by a diesel donkey engine, a coal-fired railroad yard engine, 2 stake-sided gondolas for hauling lumber, and an old diesel crane mounted on railroad tracks for moving logs from the river and loading finished lumber onto barges. All the exhibits were housed in a massive pole barn, while stone chimneys, ovens, and drying kilns with rail tracks for processing would remain intact. The only modern building on site was a state-run garage used for road maintenance equipment. It had a propane-heated office with telephone service and electricity, since workers sometimes spent full shifts there. The facility also included a heated restroom with showers. The entire building was zoned for heating with overhead blowers, keeping work areas warm and ensuring snow-clearing equipment engines remained operational through winter. The sale contract came with strict conditions. No new buildings could be constructed without board approval. Logging was prohibited without permission. The land couldn't be subdivided, and insurance was mandatory for all structures. If the property was resold, the state had the first right of refusal. So why would I even consider buying it? First, the price would be low since the restrictions made it unattractive to most buyers. Second, it was already fenced off, making it easy to secure. Third, taxes would be minimal as the land was only suitable for hunting. Most importantly, its location was ideal, just 4 miles by river or 7 miles by road from Marquette. But the biggest draw? I'd have 70 acres of included woodland all to myself with no neighbors in sight. I would never have thought about pursuing the property but for the fact that the place was to be sold as is. The diesel road and grounds maintenance equipment in the maintenance shop were listed on the document of particulars. I made my living doing mowing and snow removal for Greenwood College, just down the road from me to the west. The only hang-up I could see was keeping the insurance paid. I investigated with my local provider, giving them all the property details I could find. They priced it out by size and function. The garage was 40 by 80 feet and 16 feet to the eaves. The exhibit barn was 60 by 180 feet and 24 feet to the eaves. It had a center line of poles to hold up the roof. The engines were kept winterized, so no fuel was stored in the hall. There was a blacksmith exhibit at one end of the hall, but by the pictures it looked as if it had been mothballed for years. With the place being sold into private hands, the risk of industrial accidents and arson went down dramatically. I was given a quote of $900,000 for the barns and a property insurance rate of $13,500 a year for fenced-off, unimproved woodlands. So it would take me about $3,500 plus fuel, electric, and garbage service to operate. I put in a bid of $6,000, then sat back to watch the fools who couldn't or wouldn't read the contract get themselves into trouble. Hell, I could afford the $6,000 out of my savings, and my monthly disability checks came out to almost $2,200 a month. On bad days, I rode a wheelchair, and I legally owned a handicapped placard for my pickup truck. I'd been whacked just hard enough with the business end of a bucket loader, not enough to cut my legs off, but enough to come close to losing them in surgery. I was still in advanced individual training AIT in the Army when it happened. I ended up with 2 fake knees out of the deal and really screwed up lower legs. Sitting in the cab of an earth mover, a tractor, a skid loader, or a bobcat was just up my alley. Several more bids were entered, all at quite a bit more than mine, but they were promptly withdrawn after further research was done. Come June 1st, mine was the last soldier standing. I won the competitive bid for the property. Hot damn. I walked a little taller, and if I could have strutted, I would have. I still had to get there, though, and before the snow got heavy. That gave me a deadline of well before Thanksgiving. Driving around randomly after work, I passed a dirty Fleetwood RV that was sitting in someone's backyard for what must have been the 5th time. My back brain knew what I was looking for, even if my front brain was too oblivious to see it. I stopped in front of the house, hobbled to the front door, and rang the bell. A young woman answered. I gave her my best homely grin. Ma'am, I'd like to buy your camper. I got the damnedest reaction from her. She looked terrified. She backed away from the door with her hands in front of her chest as if to push me away. I put my weight on my crutch handles in my pits and held my hands up. Easy, lady, easy. I just thought that you had an old camper you wouldn't mind getting rid of. It's half covered by an old torn tarp, the tires are half flat, and it doesn't look like it's been moved in years. She calmed down a little and invited me in. Over a cup of coffee, we talked. I told her about wanting a prefab house to sit inside a commercial garage. She gave me the story on the thing. Her parents bought it well before she was born. They spent every vacation in it, usually down in southern Missouri at Bull Shoals Lake in the Ozarks. She'd been in college when they took a Thanksgiving trip to the Michigan Dells. The heater had poisoned them. She'd been alone for the past 3 years, totally unfit for dealing with it all. She looked pretty lost even after getting it off her chest. All right, I said. Let's break it down. Keep in mind, I'm still after that camper, though. What's your plan from here? Where do you want to be in a year? At college in Tampa, she said. I've got relatives in town. Do you have a confirmed place to go? Yes. I could lease or buy a place near campus if I had to. Their insurance paid off. It's all money in the bank right now. That takes care of the next question. Will you have enough money to live on while in school? So far, it sounds like you've got to sell off here and head south. What's holding you back? I don't know. When do you need to be on campus? August 18th. That's not long if you're going to sell the house. Thank God Duluth is just down the road and there's always a market for housing for grad students who want to live off campus. If it were me, I'd be getting the place cleaned up and selling it furnished to a campus housing broker. It's a decent-sized place within 5 miles from campus on a major highway, so winter access won't be a problem. You'll be out from under before you know it and on your way south. Sort out what you want to have shipped to you, like favorite furnishings and a bedroom suite. Sort out what you want to take with you in the car, some bedding and clothing. Then let the brokers clean out what they don't want. They'll want some places furnished, some unfurnished, depending on the market. Now, you still want to get rid of that old camper? It's either take it along or lose it. She shook her head violently. I'm not setting foot in that thing again. I asked again. What do you want for it? She looked me in the eyes. I could see that she had just crossed the Rubicon from the look in her eyes. $3,000 as is? I goggled. Is that all? Rather, I should be asking if it starts and what the mileage is on it. You're right, if it starts, $3,000. If not, $2,000. I blinked, then stuck out my hand. Sold. Got any keys? Are there any papers on it? We shook, then she brought out an old, gray-painted, sheet steel file box labeled camper. I opened it to find the original title. It almost qualified as an antique. It was a 1988 model with a single pull-out to expand the living room. Let me get my truck, and we'll see if we can jump the battery. Oh, it tried, but that diesel had been sitting in the tank for over 2 years. It had turned to water, grease, and fertilizer in storage. Nope. It wasn't winterized before being stored. I bet the water lines were split from freezing too. It was going to need new rubber all around and maybe a brake job. I'd get the belts and hoses changed out before taking it too far, and the oil definitely needed replacing. Fine, she said, holding out her hand. $2,000 as is. I smiled, but I had to complain. Cold, woman. Cold deal. We shook on it. She signed the title, gave me the box of paperwork, and we traded receipts. Do you have an address I can reach you in Florida? I wouldn't want to short you if I find a cash box on board or something. Also, I'll write down my address. I really want a copy of your parents' death certificates. I'll leave you $100 for the copies. I have a feeling the company might want to pay off rather than be faced with a fatality suit. I've got some research to do before I put my foot in it, though. We exchanged particulars, expecting never to see each other again. I remembered something about the Fleetwood Company paying off a lot of wrongful death settlements a while ago. I wondered if I could tie these deaths to it. Tiny little towns seem to either have bloody idiots for mechanics or bloody geniuses. My tiny little town was called Malta. James at Arn Auto was a member of the latter group. I called them to come and get the camper with a warning about the heater being a killer. My instructions were to make it trustworthy, including the generator. By the time they were done, it cost me another $3,000 to get it out of hock. The parts list was nothing short of amazing. I was about broke for the month when it came back to me. I didn't make anything from the college during the summer. I was living on freezer biscuits, peanut butter, and jelly until my government check came in the second week in July. I bought a roll of drawn copper tubing and a handful of compression fittings. I already had a cutting and flaring tool. I set about replacing all the split lines. They were easy to test. All I had to do was pump up the pressure at 4 a.m. when nobody was making any noise and listen for the hissing. When I finally got it all sealed, I applied pressure and left it alone for a weekend. When the pressure held for 48 hours, I had a good system. I stripped out all the sheets, blankets, and curtains for a good washing. I borrowed a steam cleaner from the college to treat all the carpets. Pretty soon, it started smelling fit to live in. Duluth, just to the east, offered a legal advocate service. By that time, I had the death certificates in hand. I made an appointment to inquire about a corporate wrongful death suit. The fellow I met with was older. He looked like a retired lawyer just staying active. I was glad to have drawn him out of the pool, as he immediately proved his mettle. After reading my files, he closed his glasses and tapped the files with one finger. I remember this case. It was a kind of double indemnity. After the first discovery of culpability, the company refused to issue any recalls. Consequent deaths were judged avoidable, and the court dropped the hammer on them. The dates seemed to match up. Let me do a little research and call you back next week. He took copies of all my paperwork and my phone number. I found it hard to sleep that week, wondering what he'd find. Tuesday morning, I got a call. Do you want to sue for wrongful death and mismanagement? ITLL cost you $45 for the court costs. I'm in. I recited my bank routing number, account number, and a check number to pay him. I resolved to forget about the whole thing until it was resolved. There was nothing else I could do to influence the matter after all. I no doubt put the cart before the horse, but I pretty much moved into that Fleetwood RV. I wired shut the gas feed to the heater so nothing stupid would happen. Just as the hunter's moon lit up the October sky, I received an envelope in the mail. I had so put the case out of my mind that the return address caught me flat stupid. Then I caught on. I took the mail inside and sat at the kitchen table. Then I carefully opened the envelope. It held a letter and a greenish-colored computer-printed check. It had a multicolored stamp for an endorsement. I braced myself and read the amount to myself twice. 3 times. I finally got the decimal point in the right place. The check was for $2.7 million. I wondered who was screaming. It was me. I settled down enough to call Lisa. Lisa here? Lisa, this is the guy on crutches from Malta. Remember me? Oh, hi. How's it going? Boy, she sounded a lot better. Pretty good, actually. Really good. I had a guy sue the Fleetwood Corporation for the wrongful death of your parents and negligence in not notifying the owners of a known, potentially fatal issue. I've got a lot of money here waiting for you. Keep it. The family that I found down here, we hold most of the voting stock in Greenwood Lumber. It isn't worth it to me to come get it. But it's over $1 million. Fine. You earned it. You keep it. Good job in bleeding the people responsible. I'll always thank you for that. We talked a bit more as she let me down easy, then hung up. Well, crap. I went out to eat that night in celebration. I don't remember much about what I had or how it tasted, though. All I remember were all the plans I made for the next day and how they flip-flopped like a fresh-caught carp. It all came crystal clear as I lay there in bed. After cleaning up and dressing, I drove into Duluth with the check to get it deposited in the credit union. I was a little early, so I had a light breakfast. Once they opened, I went in and signed 40% into an account for the income tax men. Since I wasn't the injured party, I figured that 40% was what was paid out for a lottery winner, so that would do. I talked to the branch manager, who unequivocally stated that any money left with the credit union would be covered as if it were under the blanket of the FDIC. I was damn tempted to say, prove it. But I didn't stir the mud. I took out 2 money orders for $250,000 each, then arranged for both a checking account and a debit card. I didn't want to fold those money orders for fear that I'd break them or something. I'd never seen so much cash in one place before. Jesus. Everything I wanted to keep made it into the camper. I put my pickup on the sales lot and sold the house to the same property broker that I had suggested Lisa use. A trip to Janesville got the camper to the dealer that had done all its maintenance according to the paperwork. I drove up and talked to the manager. When he heard that I wanted the heater replaced under warranty because it had already killed 2 people, he wasn't very happy. When I started laying pieces of paper on his desk, including the legal finding of 2 counts of negligent homicide, he caved. It took some of the sting out of it for him when I had the entertainment system upgraded to include new speakers, a Blu-ray player, and a 40 DVD disc changer. I had the mattresses replaced as well as the driver's seat and the recliners. He had a much more efficient refrigerator freezer in stock that I also bought. He pretty much worked the thing over. I got it licensed and insured for Michigan. Highway 94 took me due north to Marquette, where the Hampton Inn became my temporary center of operations. First things first, I hired a car and driver for the day. A visit to the Marquette County Employee Credit Union got those pesky money orders off my hands. Next, I got a local cell phone and a copy of the business Yellow Pages. Once established at my new digs, no doubt I'd need to get some essential services turned back on, such as electricity, and get a propane tank filled. Our next stop got me wheels, a low-mileage Chevy Silverado diesel. I had the driver follow me to the Michigan forestry site that had sold off the property. I produced my winning bid paperwork and receipt. I was handed the title and keys to the property. Before going out to it, I got the both of us fed at a local burger joint. Then we explored a few back roads until we found a way to the property gate. The lane and gate were partially covered in leaves, pine needles, and cast-off limbs. The gate was made of black painted pipes filled with diamond fence mesh and mounted on a rolling track. My keys did the trick and the gate slid back. About a half-mile further down, an asphalt road brought two tall yellow limestone smokestacks into view. What must have been a sawmill and two big pole barns over 200 yards apart. There was an asphalt parking lot at one end of the shorter building and more paved driveway in front of four big garage doors on one side. It was off to one side and down a short lane from the big clearing. That's where I went first. I got out of the car and headed for the office door. It opened easily. The driver followed behind me to slake his curiosity. It was a pretty generic office setup with a counter, a couple of desks, and two smaller offices with doors. A light film of dirt everywhere showed that the place had been idle for at least half a year, probably due to a staffing reduction. I picked up the phone and was met with silence. I nodded. The light switch did nothing. Again I nodded. It was only to be expected. Without power, the heaters wouldn't work either. The dim light from the windows showed me a doorway out to the service and storage bays. The light showed through slots between the pole barn sheets and holes where some fool had used the building for target practice. Christ, this needed work and fast. One thing I did spot on the office wall I liked a lot. A laminated, D-sized plot of the county road system. Sitting on one end of the counter was my best find yet. A cable modem. Yippee! The place was wired for internet. We left the place as we found it, except for my pickup truck parked outside the office doors, and headed back to the hotel. I picked up the camper, released the driver, and drove back out to the property, where I parked in the lee of the garage building. After I turned off the engine, I found that it was quiet as hell. I liked it, seeing as how there was a skiff of snow everywhere. The temperature had to be low enough to freeze water. Hopefully, the water pipes inside had been winterized. I'd find out soon enough. I deployed my little generator to provide power to the camper services and called it home. A cell phone call got the electric account attached to my credit union account. I was promised to have the power restored within 24 hours. The LP gas dealer was even better. He promised to have the tanks filled by that evening. There were two of them. It being already late in the afternoon, I thought it was pretty ambitious, but who was I to complain? Another call got the phone service turned on, which also got the internet service turned on. I got a 2-day estimate on those. A little snooping inside showed me the heater controls, water heater, electrical panel, and the controls for the big overhead garage doors. I sure wasn't getting those open without power. They were big suckers sized for a tractor trailer. I did a little research with the phone book. I found a local pole barn contractor and gave him a call. He was willing to come out to look at the job of patching the barn, insulating it, and sheathing the interior. That was the end of my business for the day. I cooked dinner, ate, and cleaned up afterward. I felt satisfied enough to have a beer while I thought about whatever might happen next. I made a note to get my insurance issues addressed the next day and to get some health insurance for myself. I considered getting a propane fuel generator installed so power outages wouldn't leave me high and dry if a storm took out the lines. I discussed this last issue along with a couple of other matters with the contractor when he arrived. I'd like this structure sealed, insulated, and sheathed inside to make it relatively winterproof. Also, I'd like windows installed against the wall opposite the large doors that would match the windows on one side of my motorhome. And I'd like some ducts and hoses put in to vent my camper's heater, range, and water heater as well. Now, I've recently come into some money and have always fancied owning a modular bathing and sauna building. I know that they're available as an almost drop-in unit. I've got plenty of propane available here as well. My last item is a safety issue. I don't believe that the heaters in here are ducted outside. As the building was left unsealed, I don't want the damn things to kill me from CO2 or CO poisoning. I'd like you to investigate and amend things as required. Be sure to look into cooling for the summer as well as heating for the winter in 3 major zones. Be sure that one of the options is a straight, high-volume draft fan for the open space. The contractor nodded. We can handle that. I recalled that I hadn't arranged for solid waste recovery. There was a small brick bin set aside for a dumpster, but nothing was in it. I ordered a covered unit with a bi-weekly service contract. I was happy to see the lights flicker on in the workshop and the office. I quickly cut power to the generator and ran a line to the internal circuits. The temperature in the office quickly came up to shirt sleeve conditions, as did that of the restroom electric heaters. I had to open the master valve to obtain water service, but that was all. The bathroom looked like it was designed to follow the East German industrial school aesthetic, stark, utilitarian, and ugly as hell. I asked the contractor about getting it remodeled when he returned later in the week to schedule a start date for the insulation and window job. He promised to bring me some literature on modular bathing and sauna units, so I knew he'd be looking me up. After he left, I settled down to drink a beer and see what I could catch on the camper's dish. The game I caught was so boring that I dropped off. Around 4 a.m. I woke up, stretched, had a shower, and went to bed for the evening. The next day, I went to the assessment office to see how they had my property listed on their books. The assessor's secretary looked it up for me. It was listed as unimproved forest land. I objected to their classification. Instead, it should have been unimprovable. Since I could not change it or profit from it, the land was worse than owning desert property. I put forth that it was equivalent to owning title to a hazardous waste site. It took a county board meeting to try my case before my tax rate was rationalized. They had me on the fire rolls and the road maintenance, which I was glad to pay for. I paid roughly $1,300 a year instead of over $11,000. Some folks were grumpy about it, but they were hoist by their own petard. They'd written the stringent land use policies into the contract, and it came back to bite them in the butt. Their budget did benefit from a staffing reduction by perhaps 7 employees, so they couldn't complain too much. What's the old story? Employees are the most expensive asset a corporation owns. Since it was an inside heated job, the contractor tackled my remodeling and HVAC work right away. It promised to give some of his core workers a nice paycheck for Christmas. I paid him to haul in a nice big chest freezer to sit against the back wall of the garage. The office turned into a nice wood-paneled living room, and my new modular sauna bath was great on my knees when they really hurt. For Thanksgiving dinner, I looked through a newspaper to see who was advertising. The prices made my eyes water a bit as I paid a $50 bill. I wondered how the locals could afford it. I remembered as a kid going to an all-you-can-eat buffet not far north of Marquette for $4.56 each for 4 adults. How the times had changed. I used my phone book to call around to all the butcher shops within 20 miles to see who would do a dry-aged quarter of prime beef, some yearling venison, and smoked pork for me. I did a lot of my grocery shopping at IGA, Independent Grocers of America. Chicken stews got boring, and so did roasts made from beef and venison. I knocked together a windbreak porch out of fiberglass panels and 4x4s that would hold my Weber grill and a couple of bags of charcoal. That and an occasional hit on a pizza parlor made life a lot brighter. Late in the winter, I paid a guy with a slow-flying plane to make a couple of photographic runs over the property on a cloudless day. Once in the morning and once in the evening. Once developed and blown up to a decent size, they showed where the fire roads had been cut. I talked to the fire marshal about how wide the access lane should be and bugged the Forest Preserve Land Use Board to get permission to cut back the growth and pull the stumps to clear those lanes. They thought it was a pretty good idea. While the ground was still hard, I gradually stripped back the cuts. I left the pulled shrubbery and treetops in 4 huge slash piles for deer bedding. After the ground thawed, I hand-cast a few acres of high-protein deer forage seed that I bought from Cabela's. I had an idea of how to get around some of the forestry restrictions. They said I couldn't clear-cut or harvest the trees for profit. I looked at all that land that the sawmill operation had clear-cut for log storage and got an idea. I talked to a guy from the forest preserve to come help me document everything with his cameras. Bit by bit, I cut down 8 acres of trees that had been growing unmolested for over 100 years. I trimmed them and stacked the small stuff to one side near one of the big kilns. Then I drenched the soil with water and used chains to pull the stumps, which also went into a kiln firebox. I ordered a few drums of diesel fuel for the mill's donkey engine and used a box full of rotary stones chucked into an electric drill to sharpen one of the big rotary sawmill blades. I got the ricks of partially peeled green logs loaded in the kiln and, after warning the fire department, fired it up. A couple of steel pipes perforated with air holes helped supply more air to burn everything when the sawmill's donkey engine was hooked up to an air pump. After a couple of days, I was out of fuel. After the fire went out, I opened the doors at either end of the kiln to let the residual heat and moisture escape. After a short week, the lumber was cool enough to work with. I loaded the sawmill chute and powered up the repurposed donkey engine. Once I got it running, the forestry department guy started filming. I wore earmuffs and a breathing mask. Sawmills are loud and dirty operations, make no bones about it. I squared off the logs and cut the largest dimensional lumber that I could. I took the logs from one kiln and stacked the finished lumber on pallets in the other kiln, so I had the wood under protected storage at all times. When I was done, I used the slash to do a final slow heating of the finished product, and the Forest Preserve District hauled away the sawdust for their trail maintenance. A 1-inch thick rotary saw blade makes a lot more sawdust than you'd expect. I talked to an arborist, that's a nurseryman that deals with trees. He gave me some suggestions for planting orchards, apples and pears. I gave him the go-ahead to plant 8-foot saplings in a wide grid. Such large starters were expensive as hell, but they had a much better chance of surviving transplant shock or being destroyed by local critters. I felt pretty good about what I'd done so far. I'd set up 6 deer bowers and planted some forage. I knew that some of it would come back to bite me in the ass, as they would smell the orchard. I'd just have to either harvest a few deer or investigate what it would take to set up a wolf or coyote urine dispenser to chase them off. I'd worked with bobcat urine before to keep critters out of a garden. One sniff of that stuff would straighten you right up and make you have second thoughts about the whole deal. It was the slow season for farmers, early to mid-July. The fields were ripening, the early hay was ready for cutting, vegetable gardens were coming in, and the farmers' markets were showing evidence of a bountiful harvest. I was in town, sitting at a diner, savoring a piece of cherry pie made by someone who knew what they were doing, and sipping a cup of coffee before heading to the local farmers' market for my weekly lettuce and tomato fix for fresh BLT sandwiches. A guy called out to me. "Are you the fella that bought the old sawmill from the DNR?" I motioned him over to the table and folded up the newspaper I'd been giving half my attention to. "Yep. I've been putting some good money into it, too, as the state hasn't been tending to it for several years. It shows." Now I had his curiosity up. "What you been doing?" I sat back with my cup and put my thoughts in order. So far, I've moved my camper inside the garage and vented it. The garage is insulated and lined now. I had a sauna put in and the old office has been renovated to be my living room. I talked the conservation board into letting me clean up the fire roads. I piled the brush I cut at the ends of the lanes for deer mangers and scattered seed for forage nearby. Hopefully within the next decade, we'll be seeing some trophy deer coming out of there. I've stripped a few acres near the sawmill where the logs used to be stacked and planted a small orchard. Yeah, you could say I've been busy. Damn. You mind showing the place off? I used to play around out there as a kid. About killed myself a few times too. You found the dump yet? Dump? No. I'd like to see that. If it needs cleaning up, then I'll tackle it. Hell, I'm retired now. I need a few projects to work on. I've yet to visit the farmer's market today and the liquor store, then I'm heading back. Mind if I tag along? No, not at all. I don't know too many people around here. I figure that it's about time that I socialize some. I picked up a half-dozen ripe tomatoes, a couple of heads of lettuce, some radishes, onions, and potatoes. Down the road a bit, I picked up a couple of cases of beer and a bottle of bourbon. I'd noticed some auction notices in the paper, so I picked up a more current copy to take home. With that big county map on the wall, I could find about any property I wanted to. Roger and I slowly walked around the place. I showed him my new orchard, which was doing pretty well under the arborist's care. He came by once a month to check on everything. Roger showed me an overgrown area that he said was a big pit filled with rock and busted-up timbers with a little dirt thrown over the top. It wasn't too far from the river. I got the bright idea of digging a channel from the pit to the river and using a high-pressure water hose to flush everything clear. I had a great way to get rid of the buried wood and the brush that was growing, a kiln firebox. Roger and I shook hands and he left, but only after promising to loan me an old picture album documenting the sawmill in operation. I had a project running around loose in the back of my head. I didn't know whether to stomp it flat or listen to it. I decided to show up at the next monthly DNR meeting to see what they thought of the idea. I spent a few weeks at the computer, typing away, putting my thoughts to paper, and costing out my materials over the web. Buying the water pump would be expensive, as would renting the crane to drop in the concrete culvert once I was done flushing the overburden from the dump. The garage held a Cat 324 hydraulic excavator and a Ford F550 dump truck with a 12-foot bed and a 9-foot snow blade. I'd used some late winter downtime cleaning them up with rotary wire brushes and repainting them. The pickup bed and snow blade needed some attention with a welder to add metal where it had either rusted or been ground away. The dump truck needed a heater core, a radiator, and a couple of pumps, but I got it back into commission. Everything got new batteries, fresh belts, and had their hydraulics flushed. The service log on the excavator showed that the track body had just been rebuilt the year before. It was in excellent shape. Somebody had bought a John Deere 4520 tractor with a rollover bar, hydraulic front loader, and a mower deck. It was almost new, which made me wonder why it was left in the garage when they sold the place. I wanted to rebuild the place to look like it did when it was a working timber operation. I wrote down plans to build a historically correct site office building out of limestone blocks and clay tile roofing to keep the place from burning down from embers coming out of the smokestacks. The dock would also have to be rebuilt where the logs were pulled from the river and the barges loaded. I'd need to find some rail to extend the local line out onto a pier, and the pier would have to be built solidly enough to withstand the stresses of the railroad engine running over it, the winter freeze-over, and the spring ice dams. I'd have to pay an architect to figure out the best way to approach this. I calculated that I'd need roughly 40 limestone blocks of 2 feet by 2 feet by 3 feet or 2 feet by 2 feet by 4 feet, depending on what was available on the market, plus 2 dump trucks full of heavy road gravel for the foundation to lay the walls and floor. The porch, the floor, roof, and office counter were good candidates for the cut lumber I produced. I was sure that I could find an old slate blackboard or 2 for the day tallies. Potbelly stoves were available for a heater. I did a little research on the web. Since the streets of Marquette were being lit with electricity by 1894, I figured that it was within the bounds of reason that the office had electric lighting rather than kerosene lamps. If no stone blocks were found in the dump, then the office would go up for $55,000. I had no figures on the rail line extension. I made up some nice covers for my request. I blew up one of Roger's old prints of the operation and had it printed in sepia as a cover sheet. I set up a 4-year schedule until completion, then added another year to construct a classroom-type facility out of native dimensional lumber procured from the open market. They were skeptical at first, to say the least. But as they read further and I talked my way through it, they began to come around. The idea of building the office to match the facilities and terminating the rail line as it was used during the site's operating days appealed to the historians among them, and cleaning up the old dump made the DNR folks all for it. I think what really clinched it was the chance of disposing of a lot of otherwise unusable material dug out during ditch clearing operations. The final phase, which set up a lecture hall and a live historical demonstration of an operating sawmill once a month for high school and college students, sealed the deal. Their total cost to the county? Just the fuel, lecturers, and demonstrators, the latter of which I could train. First, the dump had to go. It was an illegal dump and a breeding ground for vermin. The County Historical Society had just been given a fire engine pumper that still worked. They let me use it, but it was up to me to figure out how to operate the thing. A trip to the fire department got me in touch with a couple of retired firemen who would do it for me. I started digging out the channel between the dump and the river. That excavator was the cat's pajamas. I got the culvert ordered, 20 feet long by 14 feet wide by 20 feet tall. The concrete company floated it down the river to me on a barge within 2 weeks. I got the channel cleared out, then the flushing operation began. 2 weeks later, the water coming out of the dump was as clear as it was going to get. I managed to seat the culvert with the chain and the excavator before the winter freeze set in. The dump itself was over the size of a football field. I had no idea how deep the thing would turn out to be. I spent a lot of time that winter working with a cheap version of Photoshop, getting those prints copied, blown up, cleaned up, and in presentation quality. I even found a picture of the inside of the office. It featured a 2-hole potbelly stove with a couple of chairs next to it and a small table. I could just make out the grid scored into the surface in the form of a checkerboard. One window looked out to the sawmill in the background. It took a lot of work to enhance that little 3x5 photograph. Once the ground froze, the temperature quickly dropped. That winter, it hovered around 0 for 2 weeks near Thanksgiving. Then the wind picked up. Tiny little beads of pellet snow fell for days. It squeaked like crazy when walked on. When it hit 14 below for Christmas and stayed colder than 10 below until the middle of January, the weather pontificators on TV said that it was the area's coldest winter in recorded history. The river froze over, but I sure wasn't going to risk my butt testing if it would support my weight. I turned down the thermostats in the garage building to about 40 to keep the water lines from freezing. I lived in the mobile home. Its heavy layer of insulation and smaller volume to heat made it a much cozier environment. The sauna was super insulated, so I spent my time between the Fleetwood and the sauna. I only did 1 load of laundry per week. I didn't have to worry so much about filling the septic tank with washing water that way. Right off the bat that spring, I ran into an unexpected expense. I bought a big spool of wire rope that I could run in and out with the donkey engine. I had to snag all that busted up wood out of the dump and couldn't figure out any way to do it other than using a huge 2-jaw clamp on a cable to yank the stuff out. I purchased a used skid steer to pack the old wood into the empty Kills fireboxes while the rest of the burnable detritus was packed into the top section. It had saturated over the years and needed some time to dry. Then the DNR made me put ember catchers on the kiln chimneys to keep from starting a forest fire or 6. That was a pricey install because I had to hire a couple of guys to climb the towers and install them. I wasn't fool enough to climb those towers with my knees. By midsummer, I had cleared out the first 18 feet of the dump. There was a lot of road-building dross and even more old timber, stumps, and shattered trunks. The County Road Commission must have been using it as a hidey hole that they didn't have to pay for over the years. I piled the broken concrete and asphalt not far from the river where the timber drag was. It would make great fill for the pier once I got the outer pylons pounded in. I finally got down to the layer used by the old sawmill operation. There were more big blocks of limestone than I cared to count, all thrown haphazardly into the pit. I gradually pulled those giant pavers out of the pit, piled them one high on pallets, and loaded up a drying oven. I actually took out most of the fuel that had been packed inside before for firing it. I just wanted to drive off the moisture in the stone, not glaze or crack it. It was a low, slow operation. I had to jury-rig a blade onto the front of the tractor that extended out some 10 feet, so that I could refuel the fire without letting it all go out or cool. I dried those stones over low heat for 2 weeks per batch. After all, they had been submerged and saturated for years. I got the foundation dug for the office. A crew laid down 6 inches of dry sand, the way it was done long before. Then I started fitting the blocks. They weren't perfectly finished or anything like that. I filled the voids with sand mixed with construction adhesive so that it would at least look right while holding out the weather. I didn't get the roof on before ice in, but I got the walls up and pulled another full load of stone for the oven before I had to shut down for the season. I covered the building with a layer of visqueen held down with 2x4s and rocks. During the winter, I'd bundle up, walk outside with a coffee, and admire the thing. It looked like it belonged. I'd use the images from the archive to locate and turn it until everything matched before I even thought about cutting that foundation. Come spring, I asked the county for trees and root balls that got pulled out of the ditches. Come on, boys, lay that firewood on me. I got enough for 3 kiln firings without paying a dime. Not much but pine, birch, cedar, and poplar grow around there. I had to send away for the oak sleepers I'd need to rebuild the rail lines as they had been. I spent more than a few days looking over that old wood and coal-fired yard engine that had been used to move the stock in and out. The thing was sure intimidating. I didn't have any manuals for it, and the last guys who had run it probably died in the 1930s or 40s. I figured to use the rest of the limestone blocks as a base for the sleepers. I was planning ahead on how to get the materials ready for that phase. I knew that I'd have to buy the rail screws, base plates, and tension blocks as well. Then there was the little problem of who was going to do the build-out. It sure wouldn't be me. I was told that there was a steam tractor club a ways to the west. I looked them up on the web, made a few phone calls, and drove out to Eau Claire with a fistful of photographs of my steam engine. The group was made up of farmers, businessmen, factory workers, just about every job description you could think of. They told me to buy 8 tons of coal and where to buy it cheap. Then plans were made for a July road trip. I sure had the space for campers, and I could arrange for a 3-phase 440-volt line to the barn. Getting the big nuts off of the firebox and the steam chest pretty much demanded having a big air impact wrench, which needed a really big compressor. I had some work to do. I needed to set up a big, gnarly workbench and an overhead chain hoist for them to work with. It wasn't original equipment, but after the first load of wall stone was done that spring, I added a full-length porch to the office building. Then I had a builder come in and roof the place. I had to rush out to get the stove and pipes so that he'd know where to run the hole and flashing. The windows, doors, counter, and blackboard I managed on my own. Did you know that there are companies that still make the big, clear glass light bulbs with a curly filament in them? They're great for historical recreations. That front porch was a great place to keep a big wood pile dry. I also hid my Weber kettle there. I was almost ready for the steam club's visit. I sat down with a beer and envisioned just how far I wanted to go with this. I had looked at the pictures of the operation and wrote down the particulars. The exhibit hall held a diesel crane car, 2 stake-sided gondolas, a coal-operated yard engine, and a coal tender. To use all this, I'd need a water tower, a coal bunker with a chute, about 2 miles of track, and 3 manual track switches laid out in a T-turnabout. Now we were talking real money here. I sat back with my brew, wondering how to get some help with this. Government grants were drying up like sips in the desert. Then I got an idea that put a smile on my face. Maybe a local rail company or a timber company might like to get in on the deal for the advertising. I wouldn't know until I asked. The local timber companies like Greenwood Lumber wanted no part of the operation. But Great Lakes Rail? They must have been looking for a project for a while. They sent out a barge load of people and equipment to lay all the track and switches required, and they wanted to build a second exhibit hall. I shrugged my shoulders and pointed their lawyers at the local development council. The bane of my existence. I guess that if you wear an expensive enough suit, you can get away with damn near anything. A new access road was cut and paved, leading directly to the highway. The exhibit hall went up, and it was filled with air-appropriate railroad equipment from back when steam was king. They donated to my fund for the classroom hall but didn't get involved other than that. The steam team had that crane working within 2 months. The yard engine took a little longer. I was amazed. The things probably hadn't been touched in most of a century. Took a lot of grease, though. I carefully watched them and became both an oiler and an engineer. I learned what it took to keep them operational and to actually operate the engine and the crane. With the crane, the dump got cleaned out a lot faster than I thought it would. It gave the county a place to start dumping rock and mud from their ditch-clearing operations. I damn well billed them for the privilege, too. Since the thing was bigger than a football field and some 70 feet deep, I figured that might take them a while. I knew enough not to fall into it, but sooner or later we'd be getting tourists through the place. I used the excavator to build a solid timber fence around it. If I hadn't, my liability insurance would have eaten me alive. With easier access to the highway, I examined opening the place up as a private park, charging so much for day use, so much for a week's pass, and so much for a yearly pass. I'd have to thin out part of the old timber storage yard to provide for a driving path and picnic sites. I'd also have to provide for sanitation and perhaps a couple of open-sided picnic shelters with grills and water taps. For winter use, I'd have to think, but I didn't see any reason that I couldn't make wall sections that could be fastened in place and provide a stone fireplace in a rock wall at one end to make them heating shelters. I'd seen them at public campgrounds before. They looked quite handsome. I could even use the timber harvested while thinning out the area to build the shelters and wall segments. That sawmill was going to get some more exercise. Paving the road, putting in the toilets, septic vaults, and running the water lines would be my big expenses. I'd have to talk to the land use folks as well as the Parks and Recreation Department. I knew that they had theoretical ratios of population versus developed and undeveloped recreational areas. Since I projected putting in sanitary facilities anyway, why not put in showers as well and open up some primitive camping sites? Lord knows I could provide the firewood. I just had to get an amendment to sell the stuff. Sheep herders' wagons weren't well known in the Midwest. Grand Midwest Circus up in Baraboo had circus wagons that were descendants of the fancy gypsy Vardos. But nobody had seen a sheep herder wagon this side of Wyoming. I'd read of companies in Great Britain manufacturing them for a broad market. For some reason, Dorset rang a bell. Parks and Rec were all for a cooperative campground. They could help with the initial installation, but because of the way their budget was written, they couldn't provide any employees to help run it. They had a headcount cap, which was part of the reason my place was sold to begin with. I made arrangements with one of their botanists and a site architect to walk through the area and lay the place out, marking the trees that would come down for the road, picnic areas, and campsites. We tried to leave the healthy pines to produce a natural ground cover from fallen needles. Bands of bushes and other undergrowth were marked to be preserved to segregate the areas and provide for as much privacy as possible. We planned for 40 primitive sites, 0 improved sites. I dug out some of the dumps overburdened to make low berms, which could then be planted with heavy ground cover. It would do even better than simple brush lanes to provide line-of-sight privacy and block noise. We marked out where they would run. I added one to block off the garage building from the rest of the cleared area of the park. We scheduled the installations for later in the year to give me a chance to drop the trees and pull the stumps. I had to be careful while snaking out those trees and blowing the stumps. With the name of the guys from Parks and Rec, I got big dump truck loads of rock and dirt from Portage and Winnebago counties dropped where the berms were to go. Using the bucket on the excavator, I did a bit of primitive dredging to pull some mixed silt and sand out of the river. Using some of the mixed sawdust and slash from the sawmill along with pumped-in air, I force-dried the sludgy mess in a kiln. Once it was solid, I scraped it out with the excavator and used the tractor's bucket to lay it over the berms. I needed some decent soil in place to support plants. I went back to my arborist to find out what sorts of woody plants and low trees would thrive in the area. He gave me a list that was sorted by speed of growth. If I intermixed the fast growers with the slow growers, then when the early achievers died off, the slower growing shrubs and trees would be well rooted and ready to fill in the spaces. I mixed red alder with hedge maple, black cherry with thin leaf alder, and Amur maple with mountain laurel. I planted the tops of most of the berms with Osage orange to keep kids from cutting through and making shortcut paths. Osage orange grows slowly, but when planted as a hedge, it becomes nearly impenetrable. Once the berms were well watered, I covered them in straw. It cost me more than I originally thought it should, but then I realized I had over a mile of berms when all was said and done. I pressure washed all the equipment and garaged it for the winter. Since the space was heated, I'd be able to take my time doing maintenance on all 3 units. Well before freeze-up in early October, what looked like a construction battalion came through. They trenched and ran pipe, ran electrical lines, buried septic vaults, poured floors, installed streetlights, dug out the road, filled it with heavy gravel, rolled it down and topped it with asphalt. They'd be back in the spring to put in the fixtures, finish the plumbing, and lay the fireplaces. They did something which I didn't expect. In the wall behind the fireplaces, they installed galley kitchens. They left me with the specs for the wood they'd need for the shelters. I got busy with the kills, drying the wood, then horsed the trunks over to the sawmill to cut them to spec. I had it all dried, cut, and stacked by Christmas. All the extra lumber I cut down the middle of the logs, then chopped them into 18-inch sections. Firewood. You know, they still had to be split, but I could buy a splitter and hire someone to do the labor. I ran a spreadsheet to figure out my startup expenses and the recurring expenses. I went so far as to visit another campsite and talked over their operating expenses with them. A big one I didn't expect was the insurance. I expected the electric bill as well as the sewage and waste disposal. The labor was a given. I expected to have to buy a little ATV with a bed in the back and hire someone for minimum wage to do a daily pass around all the trash cans and rake up the overflow. Likewise, someone would have to be hired to watch the gate, take money, assign spots, and sell firewood. I asked for a copy of his camper rule sheet that he printed on the reverse side of the site map. I needed somewhere to start. I figured out who had the best rates for campground insurance. Then I proposed to the Parks and Rec coordinator that in return for respecting any state park permits, I'd like to buy into their campground insurance policy, sewage, and solid waste removal contract. He had to kick it up to the state level, but I got approval before spring. I had to incorporate the place as a non-profit operation before they could legally do anything. I didn't let my idea about sheep herder wagons drop. I took out quarter-page ads in the major newspapers of Wyoming, Montana, and northern Nevada for reclaimable wagons with stoves. I found 9 available for between $5,000 and $7,000 each. I didn't care what shape the running gear was in as long as it supported the wagon's weight. Once in place, they weren't going anywhere. I had them trucked in and lined up next to the garage. I pulled them in one by one with the tractor. All of them needed new roofs, but that was nothing more than a piece of corrugated galvanized sheet steel. More work went into stripping down the walls, insulating them, and rebuilding the interiors. I painted each of their exteriors a traditional dark green with yellow trim to keep the chance of fire down. I provided suspended kerosene lanterns, not stand-mounted. I cleared out a quarter-mile trail to another glade with a parking lot for 10 vehicles in the front. I parked the wagons in a ring, far enough from each other so that if one caught fire, none of the others would. A communal fire pit with log seats went in the center. The wagons were set up on concrete blocks to keep them from creaking and rocking. I figured that much distance from the other campground would give the area a bit of privacy without building more berms. When the contractor and his team came back in the spring, I paid extra to have the road spur dug out, rocked in, and asphalted, as well as a communal shower building and toilet installed. He insisted on putting in a street light in the parking lot that also illuminated the campground. After he left, I hired a local contractor to put a shield on that light to shade the campground. I liked the effect so much that I had all the streetlights shielded to illuminate the minimum we could get away with. It was pretty much just the parking lots and the bathhouses. There were lights inside the picnic shelters at the ridgepoles, but they could be turned on and off. The breakers to the publicly accessible electrical outlets and the switches to the lights were behind a locked door in each structure inside the kitchen door. The contractor put in regulated heaters that would keep the pipes in the kitchens from freezing come winter. His team installed lights, hoods, stainless steel tables, sinks, ranges, and ovens. I had to install refrigerators and provide trash cans. I had the electrical service for the park broken out to a separate meter. That took care of the not-for-profit regulations. I set the days we were open from May 1st until October 31st. That was 6 months. I hired 2 guys to split all the wood and pile it in face cords inside the garage. Then I contracted with an ice company to keep one of their freezers full. I bought a John Deere runabout to service the trash cans, haul cleaning supplies around to the shower buildings, as well as deliver ice and firewood. I worked with local college kids to man the gate building and do the cleanup. It was easy work compared to working in a restaurant or fast food, so I didn't lack for employees. I paid them as contractors with a 1099. After the first 3 months of operation, I found that I didn't have enough seating around the place or enough bathrooms. The seating I took care of with logs I cut. Once I rented a post-hole drill for the tractor, the contractor was available to build out 2 more bathroom facilities with running water and septic vaults, minus the showers. When I got the bill, I started looking for the platinum faucets. With that many people running through the place, I worried about idiots vandalizing the exhibits. I had some nice, visible, high-definition cameras installed and a DVD recorder set up to record images suitable for evidence in a court of law. I sure wasn't making any money. As a matter of fact, I was operating at a loss. That winter, I started a letter-writing campaign in an attempt to tap into any grants that I could. I got a small grant from Great Lakes Rail for maintenance and another from the Smithsonian Foundation. My biggest benefactor was the National Park Service, which wrote up a package to cover the operational shortfall for the next 10 years. I thought that was great. It would cover my insurance, electricity, and labor costs. I could easily live on my pension and what I still had in the bank. I worked with a couple of local schools to see if anyone was interested in founding a STEAM club. I tied into a loose confederation of STEAM clubs all over northern Michigan and Wisconsin. The big problem all of them faced was storage space. Steam engines are huge by definition. Also, if one was shut down for repair, it was likely to be for an extended period, which froze out that real estate, usually compromising most of the club's workspace. I wondered how this was dealt with before the diesel era took over. The answer was a roundhouse. The main features of a roundhouse were a feeder track to the external rail system, a turntable wide enough to cope with the longest car or engine, and a ring of work or storage bays surrounding the turntable, all on tracks. The traditional American roundhouse was just that, a monolithic covered brick building covered in soot and grime. The European model was much cheaper to build and easier to expand in stages. Once the turntable went in on its specially designed round track and the segments of a big planetary gear were bolted together, a diesel engine was installed that was geared down to spin the thing around to a precise angle. Then the turntable was capped by a wood or stone platform with one set of tracks laid across it directly through the center line. The individual working stubs were left clear for the first 40 feet to work on the engines. Then they terminated inside garages where the engines could be stored. Not every avenue had to be built out at once, more could be added on demand. I wondered how much property would be required to build out such a facility. By extending the top of the T-switch, a line could be run to the far north end of the property. Then the no lumbering clause came back to bite me in the butt. I looked at the next property to the north. There was a 30-acre field there that had been used to grow corn for so long that the soil was yellow-tan, not brown. I looked into buying it. The land was going for $8,000 an acre. That was roughly $250,000 I couldn't afford. I talked to the farmer. We did a little horse trading. I sold him the excavator and he sold me the property, all for dramatically reduced prices. To keep the taxes down, we went with a written contract specifying that he got all the spares and tools I had for it, and he'd strip out the rail line for me up to the property and set a gravel road to the new roundhouse. First, though, I had to get permission to run that rail line. Tom, the guy at Great Lakes Rail who was tracking their investment in my place, heard about the roundhouse project. His drinking buddy from Midwest Freight kept moaning about this warehouse full of roundhouse hardware that they couldn't get rid of for legal purposes. Tom called Harry. Harry called his boss, Brian. Every Tom, Dick, and Harry got excited to get that white elephant off their hands. The lawyer for Midwest Freight talked to the County Historical Commission about increasing the size of the local rail museum. It was a go. The Midwest Freight construction teams got busy building a berm, laying stone, setting sleepers, and laying track. They were nice enough to clean up and gravel in a parallel path suitable for a modern tractor or a motorized cart. Then they poured a reinforced concrete bay for the turntable, laid in the track ring, set up the trucks, bolted together the planetary gear, installed the diesel engine and its engine house, built up the platform, and laid the turntable track. Then they laid track for 12-feeder bays and built the garages for them. I'd never seen 4-foot-thick reinforced foundations before. It may have been overkill, but for damn sure, the tracks or turntable wouldn't shift from frost heave or long-term static load. It was a one-shot capital investment that eliminated a long-term cost from their operating expenses. They were happy. I was happy. And I had a lot of confused steam clubs wondering how the hell to get their rolling stock to Marquette. I pointed at the river, which was quite capable of taking river barges, then at the railhead at the pier. Lights shone in eyes. Hoses were sung. Many contracts were signed. With the nonprofit group holding the property, arrangements were made to supply power to the garages for heat, light, and tools. All the clubs pitched in to dig out and fill the gravel road from the highway to the roundhouse and to put in a parking lot. That put money in the farmer's pocket, which made him happy too. The majority of steam clubs bitched because they didn't work with steam engines, they worked with traction engines. Well, screw me running. There was enough property for the build-out. I simply turned them loose to build a huge pole barn. They didn't need much more than heat, electricity, and fuel bunkers, be it for wood or coal. What was a disaster to a long-running nonprofit, the Alex Jordan Trust for House on the Rock, proved to be a windfall for me and mine. A gas line explosion destabilized a large portion of the structure. The state was forced to condemn it. The trust scrambled for new homes for the displays. Circus World Museum took on many of the automated musical displays, and several entire exhibits went to the Museum of Science and Industry. However, nobody they could find had the room for Gladiator, the huge traction engine, and its associated automated steam calliope. I raised my virtual hand and waved it about frantically. A lawyer for the trust came to examine the facilities and was happy with the new turntable build-out. We got an amazing bit of 19th century engineering and showmanship. The engine itself had been decommissioned for decades and had to be pressure tested, but we had capable people who had done it before. With the approval of the Parks and Rec Department, we started advertising for a Midwest Rail and Steam Show to be held the third week of August, starting the next year. All the unused land reserved for the steam operation was raked flat and seeded in grass. It would take almost a year to get the root mat established. We planned on having water buffaloes and pissant tanks in place, both for the exhibitors, the public, and the campers. We arranged for bales of hay or straw to be distributed about for seats, as older folk or those broader of hip and thigh can't stand up all day. Several hay wagons were arranged for, with shuttle stops at various places: the North End parking area, the roundhouse installation, the picnic area, the train exhibit, the sawmill, then back again. We charged $5 a day for admission and $20 to camp for the week. The week before, I had a farmer come through and harvest the grass. He cut and baled the fresh grass crop and traded us bales of straw and swamp grass for seeding. I got a line on a local high school football team to come out and help with parking for $20 a day and free admission. Several food vendors saw an opportunity taking shape. With the help of the county health department, we got half a dozen vendors in place. They had it written into their contracts to clean up daily. I had to insist that all vendors provide a minimum number of seats and tables, as there was no other place set up to eat. We even had a local church group set up an enormous lemonade and hot pretzel stand. Boy, did they clean up. We had over 3,500 tickets sold, and that was just the first year. The timing of the event was perfect. There was a long-running steam show near Sycamore, Illinois, that traditionally ran the second week of August. Not only did we not conflict, but we also drew some of the same exhibitors and a large portion of the same crowd. Once we did some better advertising for the camping options, we started attracting the summer vacation crowd as well. Where else could you park a camper for a week for only $20? By the second year, we had every campsite full for the entire event, and people were reserving the picnic shelters daily. Some groups got creative, splitting the larger shelters in half, with one group taking one end and another taking the opposite side. The steam clubs pooled their resources to order tons of coal and a dumpster to haul away the ash and clinkers. We had a pair of water buffaloes on hand to refill the engines, as they constantly lost water. Some more than others. I recall one engine that looked incontinent as it rolled around the display yard. Nobody died. Nobody fell into the dump pit. Nobody got into a serious fight, and we didn't have any major grease fires. We did have half a dozen heat exhaustion calls, but with a crowd that size, it was expected. Late August in the northern Midwest is hot. Once the show was over, I had about a month's worth of work leveling out the ground where the traction engines had rumbled through. I laid out a performance ring and heavily spread cement powder over it, then gradually watered it in. It created a hard, packed surface that wouldn't get torn up as easily the following year. Despite my precautions, it took a full week just to haul out all the trash. However, the event had been profitable. Not personally, I still wasn't making any money, but I had enough of a surplus to distribute among the participating steam clubs to help with their expenses. It wasn't expected, but it was damn sure appreciated. The park expands as schools started back up in the fall. We had several field trips coming through. The schools focused on the railroad displays and the sawmill, since there wasn't much to see at the roundhouse except for the turntable and storage garages. The kids were allowed to walk around the traction engines, though they weren't as fascinating when cold and silent. Still, the sheer size of the engines impressed just about everyone. Each engine had a placard fastened to its nose describing its year of construction, where it was built, its weight, and its horsepower. I fired up the coal-driven yard engine for the students and ran it through the switchyard. I had taken hundreds of photographs of the steam team working on the yard engine. I had some great shots of the guts of the firebox and the steam chest, and I had them blown up and framed as exhibits in the shop area. This cycle repeated itself for several years. Every summer, we ran the Midwest Rail and Steam Show. Every fall, we hosted student field trips. And every winter, I sat in my office updating spreadsheets and fine-tuning the park's operations. After 10 years, the National Park Service renewed our operational grant. The price of hard work. I always knew that my legs were shot, but by this point, they were really gone. The disability checks were coming for a reason. I had lost so much control in my lower limbs that I was in a wheelchair most of the time. I could still pull myself up into my truck and drive. The power brakes and steering made that manageable. But getting the damn wheelchair in and out of the truck bed? That was another story. With nearly 50 campsites, the maintenance issues were constant. I could still mow everything from the tractor, but even that took effort. Once a week, I took a slow ride around the property, checking for damage, vandalism, or any unexpected surprises. Carpenter bees loved chewing into the sheepherder wagons. Mattresses had to be replaced more often than I liked. I bought a battery-powered runabout, a big-wheeled golf cart, basically to help me navigate the fire lanes and keep an eye on the park. It was quiet back there. The trails were chained off, so nobody wandered back unless they were on foot. I didn't have any established paths, but the deer trails went everywhere. That was when I started noticing garbage in the woods. I wasn't having that. I hired 20 kids for a week to pick up trash. Then I put up signs. Dogs crap everywhere because they don't know any better. If you can read this, then you're not a dog. Don't throw your crap everywhere. You should know better. Of course, I got lambasted in the newspaper for putting a 4-letter word on a public sign. I wrote a letter to the editor. Since the park is private property and organized as a non-profit, nobody has a single argument that I'm willing to listen to. So, sod off. I got a kick out of seeing people taking pictures of the signs while their friends stood next to them, grinning like it was a national monument. The good part? The trash problem disappeared overnight. Keeping the equipment alive, some of the exhibits were starting to look shabby. I hired a team of painters to come through and give everything a fresh coat. Bald patches in the grass got fertilized and reseeded. That year, Gladiator, our biggest traction engine, needed a $4,000 paint job. That must have touched a nerve with the others because within a month, the steam clubs organized a painting party for all the traction engines. They covered up what needed to be covered and pressure washed 10 years worth of coal smoke off the inside of the pole barn. Then they repainted everything. They even replaced all the light bulbs, and what a difference that made. When the circus came to town a few years back, Grand Midwest Circus World Museum arranged to have the park connected to a local live rail spur. Our little steam show tripled in size overnight. The circus museum didn't bring any animals or high-wire acts, but they played calliope music from morning till night. Plenty of stilt walkers, jugglers, and clowns took the opportunity to perform for the crowd. That was when I realized this place had officially become bigger than me. I had been running it all from my wheelchair for the past couple of years, but now I needed help. I hired a full-time park manager to handle the daily operations. I was fully retired. I got my mechanical knees replaced and new hip joints, too. Thank God I had kept my health insurance. Looking back now, my hair, what little remains, is solid white. I got rid of the Fleetwood RV years ago. I had a small prefab house built, one designed for wheelchair access. The park still runs like clockwork thanks to the manager and the teams of volunteers that make it happen. If you ever come to the Midwest Rail and Steam show one day, look for the old guy in the wheelchair. Come over and say hi. With the park running smoothly under its new management, I found myself in a strange position. I finally had free time. For the first time in decades, I didn't have an endless list of projects to tackle, sawdust in my hair, or grease under my fingernails. At first, it felt unnatural. Then I realized I had earned this. That first year of retirement, I did something I never thought I'd do. I traveled. Not far, just around the Midwest. I visited old steam shows, stopped in small-town diners, and struck up conversations with strangers. I spent time in Eau Claire, Janesville, Marquette, Sycamore, places I'd been too busy to enjoy before. I even visited the Illinois Railway Museum just to see how the big guys did it. I met younger folks who had grown up coming to my park every summer. They talked about how they had first seen a working sawmill there or how they remembered hearing the Gladiator Calliope playing as kids. That's when it hit me. This whole thing, the sawmill, the museum, the steam show, it had become bigger than me. It was a piece of history now. It would outlast me. Passing the torch, I still visited the park often, but my role changed. I wasn't in charge anymore. I was just the old guy in the wheelchair who people waved to. The young mechanics and steam enthusiasts took over running the yard engine and the crane. The woodshop was still operational, with apprentices learning how to work with old-growth lumber. The steam club had turned the roundhouse into a fully functioning repair facility where old engines got restored instead of left to rust. The school field trips had grown. More classes came through every year, and kids still lined up to see the steam crane lift and swing logs just like they did when the sawmill first ran over a century ago. The nonprofit had even put together a scholarship program for students interested in mechanical restoration. We weren't just preserving history anymore, we were creating careers. I'll admit, I got choked up when I saw one of the kids who used to visit every year grow up and take over running the steam show. He had been coming since he was 7 years old. Now, at 27, he was the one directing the volunteers and making sure everything was running on schedule. That's when I knew. It didn't matter what happened to me. The park would survive. The final years I still live on the property, just in a smaller house now. I gave up driving a few years ago. It was more trouble than it was worth, but people still stop by and give me rides when I need one. I spend most of my days sitting on my porch, watching the steam engines roll by. Every summer, I still roll down to the sawmill and listen to the buzz of the saw, the hiss of the steam, and the shouts of the workers, just like it was in the old days. People often ask me if I ever expected all of this when I first bid on that little forgotten piece of land. The truth? Not in a million years. But I wouldn't change a damn thing. This place, it's home. And if you ever find yourself at the Midwest Rail and Steam Show, look for the old guy in the wheelchair. Come over and say hi. I'll be here, just like I always have been. This incredible journey turned an abandoned sawmill into a thriving historic park. Would you take on a project like this or leave it behind? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this.